On August 21st, 1909, the 300-mile Wheeler-Schebler race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was waved off. Not because that weekend's racing had claimed the lives of 5 drivers, mechanics, and spectators, but because after the racing had continued, yet another car had crashed into a pedestrian bridge crossing the racing surface. No one was killed in that. The real reason the race was being flagged was because so many spectators had flocked to the pedestrian bridge itself to gape at the wreckage of the car that the whole structure was starting to sag. That was finally enough for Speedway personnel to call the race off. In the days that followed, newspapers erupted with condemnations about auto racing. But before we can really understand the outcry and its impact on the motorsport scene in the United States, we need to understand more about the man who concocted the audacious scheme to build a 2.5-mile racetrack in Indiana within the first decade of the 20th century. Today on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we are going to delve into the life of Speedway founder and confidence man Carl Fisher, and talk about how his harebrained marketing schemes brought to life a track that still hosts one of the world's greatest motorsport events to this day. Over the next 2 episodes, we're digging deep into the early history of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and how, against all odds, it became an American institution. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. If you joined us last year here on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, you'll have learned a little bit about the formation of the iconic Indianapolis Motor Speedway in the episode titled Indy 500 Rival, the Michigan race that tried to take over American motorsport. There, the goal was more to talk about the historic importance of the track in order to contextualize why 2 different open-wheel racing series would battle so damn hard for a chance to compete there. But today I want to dig deeper into the psyche of founder Carl Fisher and talk about some of his structural decisions that came to play with this track. But first, a refresher. Carl G. Fisher, founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, was born on January 12, 1874, in the town of Greensburg, Indiana. Life wasn't easy for a young Fisher. He was the second of 3 sons born to Albert and Ida Graham Fisher, and he also suffered from severe astigmatism. When Carl was young, his parents separated, and his mother moved the children to Indianapolis in hopes of forging a better life, one that wasn't so confined by financial strain. But things didn't quite pan out the way that Ida Graham Fisher had hoped. When her son Carl was 12, he quit school and took a job at the local grocery store. After his first day at work, he delivered a bundle of groceries to his mother and proudly declared, "From now on, I'm supporting this family." His adolescence was spent working all sorts of odd jobs, including something called a news butcher, which was a term for folks who hopped on local trains selling newspapers, candy, tobacco, and more. At age 17, he and his brothers had scraped together just enough funds to open a business of their own, a bicycle repair shop where they fixed flat tires for 25 cents. It was a case of right place, right time for the Fisher boys because bicycles were having a moment. A perfect storm had emerged. Gone were the ultra-tall bone shaker bikes of the past, replaced by much smaller, modern-style bikes that we would recognize today. They were way easier to mount, and they were less of a hassle to ride, and nearby Chicago had become something of a hub for the bicycle manufacturing industry. Americans were keen on escaping the noxious centers of industrial cities, and they craved the freedom that had simply not been possible before without a horse or a train ticket. Fisher was just as fascinated. He joined the Indianapolis Zig-Zag Cycling Club, which organized Sunday rides from Indy to various other cities in Indiana, and he became known as something of a menace. Perhaps thanks to his astigmatism, Fisher was prone to tumbling off his wheels, returning home battered and bruised, but still invigorated. That cycling club was the place where he met James Allison and Arthur Newby, 2 of the 3 men who would join Fisher in founding the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. For the first time in his life, Carl G. Fisher had found something he was passionate about. Though he did try his hand in the bicycle races of the era, he learned pretty quickly that his talents were more in the business management and promotion side of things than they were in the racing. He managed to convince an Ohio bike manufacturer to supply him with $50,000 worth of merchandise, all on credit, and then used promotional stunts, like riding his bike over a tightrope or releasing hundreds of balloons into the air. If you were lucky, you'd grab a balloon with a number inside, which indicated whether or not you would get a free bike. He did all that to get the product in the hands of the customers he created, and by age 19, Fisher was hugely successful. There was just one problem. Bicycles were already fading out of fashion because a new, more glamorous form of transportation hit the scene: the automobile. Fisher knew it was time to move on. He'd become friends with bicycle racer Barney Oldfield, and the two could sense the automobile was about to bring with it a revolution. The bicycle shop was refitted to become an automobile dealership and repair shop, and just like before, Fisher started peddling his product with a furor. He and Oldfield formed a little band of drivers that claimed to be the world's most daring automobile racers, and they started traveling to dirt tracks in the greater Midwest. Even Fisher got behind the wheel, setting a world record for the best time on a 2-mile race course. And yes, he kept up with his audacious gimmicks to sell his cars, going so far as to push an automobile off the roof of his shop in front of a massive audience. The car landed on its wheels, and his brothers, waiting below, started it and drove off. I don't know exactly what folks in the early 20th century were expecting to do with their cars, but the stunt proved to be massively successful in showing how robust they were. That being said, Fisher seemed to realize that he'd only find limited success by shoving cars off roofs and setting speed records. Enter the Prestolite Company. A man named P.C. Avery had purchased a patent for a specific method that used compressed acetylene gas squished into a canister and attached to an automobile to provide illumination from its front headlights. When Avery approached Carl Fisher and James Allison about perhaps investing in the company together in order to manufacture these headlamps at a greater scale, the two men leaped at the chance. At that time, if you wanted illumination at the front of your car, you had to content yourself with lanterns, which might have produced light, but didn't exactly project it. The acetylene gas canisters seemed like a genius idea, and in 1904 the three men founded the Concentrated Acetylene Company to assemble and fill the canisters that would illuminate the road in front of these early automobiles. They got off to a strong start, and when Avery withdrew from the company 2 years later, Fisher and Allison changed the name of their new business to the Prestolite Company. The technology proved popular enough to justify production plants being built in Indianapolis, Cleveland, Omaha, New York, Boston, and Chicago. But one of the main characteristics of acetylene gas is its volatility. Once it was in the canisters and attached to the car, it was completely safe. But the act of compressing the gas at a factory was a whole different story, and Fisher started to spend plenty of time in courtrooms being sued for big factory explosions. In 1908, when a plant on the South Street went up in smoke, Indianapolis mandated that the manufacturing of explosives be strictly forbidden within city limits. Rather than be deterred, Fisher and Allison simply moved their operation a few miles away. In the book Blood and Smoke, Charles Learson describes Fisher as more wistful about the whole thing than actually upset or regretful. That was kind of emblematic of the way that Fisher approached life. An Indiana Historical Society story from 2010 referred to him as an ideas man, but that when it came to actually executing those ideas, well, let me just quote from the man himself. "I have a great many men working for me who I consider to have more brain power than I have," Fisher admitted, "and I always try to get this type of men to aid me. It pays well in any sort of business to know all of your employees from the truck drivers up and to stick by them in any sort of trouble." It was a good thing James Allison was there, because it's highly likely he was more responsible for ironing out the 1911 deal with Union Carbide than was Fisher. Union Carbide purchased Prestolite for a whopping $9 million, but we aren't quite at that point of the story yet. Again, I don't think I can really overstate what a mess of a man Carl Fisher was. His first wife was a woman named Jane Watts, and she was 15 years old when she married him. But that didn't stop Fisher from fooling around with every secretary he ever had. As the Prestolite money rolled in, he took to living a crude version of the high life. As Learson says, Fisher's philosophy was to stir the pot first and figure out exactly what was cooking up later. Fisher continued to race during the early Prestolite years, having fallen head over heels for the potential that the automobile possessed. He'd leave the daily operations of the business to Allison and head off to tour the Midwest with the Big Racing Four, a group composed of Fisher, Oldfield, Al Webb, and Webb J., where, rather than actually compete in a race, the crew would charge locals $10 for a lap behind the wheel of a race car. But when Fisher's car killed a Civil War veteran in Zanesville, Ohio, Fisher was forced to make a change. No, he didn't give up racing. He instead decided that he was going to design a car with an Indianapolis automaker named Premier, and he was going to enter it in the Vanderbilt Cup. The car they produced was a massive, heavy monster that never even made it to the Long Island race, and that was likely only raced once with absolutely no success. And Fisher knew that there was no success to be found because he'd taken to traveling to Europe to see how the folks overseas did the whole racing thing. Between 1905 and 1908, Fisher started to dream. He'd sketch a racetrack outline on the back of a napkin, imagining that he'd be the man to create a circuit so damn good that the Vanderbilt Cup would have no choice but to come out to Indiana to race. But all of that dreaming was just that, dreaming, until he and his friend Lem Trotter suffered 2 flat tires and 3 breakdowns during a road trip to Dayton, Ohio. Sweaty, greasy, tired, and irritated, Fisher said, "What this country needs is a big racetrack to give manufacturers a chance to test their cars and equipment." The next morning, Fisher and Trotter went to look at a large, flat plot of land. Located just outside of Indianapolis proper and at the intersection of several railroad lines, it would be a damn good place to build a racetrack. It was smaller than Fisher might have hoped, meaning that at most his track could only be 2.5 miles long instead of his originally dreamed 3 miles. But 2.5 miles is close enough to 3. Fisher had found his place. If you decided today, in 2025, that you wanted to build a racetrack somewhere in America, you better love bureaucracy. First, you would need to have plenty of expendable dollars to snap up a large stretch of land, ideally somewhere near enough to humans that you can convince people to come to your track, but far enough away that your plans won't be nipped in the bud by a bunch of locals who adamantly oppose the noise. You'd have to secure approval from the local government and probably funding, and then jump through hundreds of regulatory hoops, taking core samples, figuring out your proximity to floodplains, grading the land, looking at the local ecosystem, and maybe, if necessary, even building the roads required to access that land. If you're hoping to build a track that a prominent series like NASCAR or IndyCar will use, then you also need to make sure your proposed track layout and facilities are up to their standards. You'll probably have to make changes, which means you'll have to take your proposal back to the local government of the area where you're building and get their seal of approval again. But they're probably going to want more changes too, so you're going to have to make them and hope IndyCar and NASCAR approve, particularly if you're relying on that local government to provide a little bit of funding. And that's not even taking into consideration the contract labor you'll need to create the track and all of the human rights you'll have to respect along the way. If you're lucky, you'll have a completed track within 3 years of your initial idea. It will probably take longer because you are probably going to run into 1,001 problems along the way. And that's not even taking into consideration the finagling you'll still have to do to actually schedule a race there, because even if you've been working closely with a race series to make sure your track conforms to their standards, those standards probably changed, and so have their goals. But back in 1908, when Carl Fisher decided he had found the ideal plot of land for his racetrack, those concerns didn't exist. At the time, there was significant pushback against the very concept of auto racing, particularly in the United States. Organized sport as a whole had really only started to come to prominence in the US during the previous decades, and even then, there was this sentiment that racing drivers weren't actually athletes because the car was doing all the work. There was a serious lack of organization in motorsport as well, and because it was so new, and because there were hundreds of competing automakers at the time, few spectators could actually understand what was going on the track if they turned up. And then there was the concern about the danger of racing. According to Charles Learson in Blood and Smoke, no one exactly kept records of the number of deaths that went on, but drivers and organizers did have a habit of starting a collection fund at the beginning of a race weekend that they would then give to the widow of whoever would die in that race. There were plenty of Indianapolis residents horrified by the idea that the prospective Indianapolis Motor Speedway would bring those deaths even closer to home, But Mayor Charles A. Bookwaiter thought the idea was grand, and so it went ahead. Just like that. No community meetings, no public hearings, no soil samples. Bookwalter believed that the sport was a great unifier, and he wanted his city unified. Instead of regulatory hurdles, the four founders of the Speedway, Carl Fisher, James Allison, Arthur Newby, and Frank Wheeler, discovered that the biggest problem was about to come in the act of construction. Not one of the four men who invested in this new track had any idea what they were getting themselves into. They assumed it would be a pretty simple endeavor, one that wouldn't distract them too much from their day jobs. They liked the idea that they'd provide a world-class facility to the good people of Indianapolis, and they especially liked the prestige that would give them in their community. They had invested their money, $250,000 in total, which would have been millions and millions of dollars today, and they firmly believed their work was done. Then, construction began. If building a racetrack is a challenge in 2025, when we have global access to the resources we need to grade and pave a circuit, imagine how much more difficult that would have been in the 1900s, when your network was limited to a handful of folks you knew in your area. One of the biggest problems came with the track surface. Chief Engineer Park Taliaferro Andrew had proposed covering the entire 2.5-mile course in bright white stones. This was critical because Carl Fisher really wanted his track to be better than everything else in America, and that could only be accomplished in two ways: by making the track bigger than anything anyone had seen, and by guaranteeing that it was no dirty, poorly graded horse track. If he couldn't go big, then those white stones were crucial. Except 2.5 miles is a very sizable length, especially when you factored in a comfortable 60-foot wide racing surface that the founders envisioned. It would require something like 90,000 cubic yards of stone. And if you're like me, I know that it can be tough to actually kind of imagine how much material that is. So here's a comparison. Modern dump trucks today can only carry about 10 cubic yards of material. You would need 9,000 modern dump truck loads to surface the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Now imagine it's 1908 and you don't have any dump trucks. You're relying entirely on laborers filling up a mule-drawn cart with your stones to deliver the necessary materials to the track. And if you want to do it quickly, then you need a small army of laborers and mules and carts. But before you even worry about getting that material to the track, you have to, buy the material. And here we have our next problem. Fisher spent months trying to find firms that stocked the exact grade and shade of the gravel he wanted. And because no single firm in Indiana had that much material, he had to strike deals with a total of 18 different companies just to consider it a job well done. Oh, and because Carl Fisher was keen on his track being better than every other track in the world, he wasn't just constructing a racing surface. He wanted a 12,000-seat grandstand and a massive 42 other buildings, which included a press shack, plenty of bathrooms, cafes, clubhouses, and judge booths. All of that needed to be built in just 5 months because Carl Fisher and publicity chief Ernest A. Moross were already taking entries for a race set to take place later in the year. Yeah, as you can see, building a racetrack from scratch was no easy affair. As early summer got underway, Fisher and Company started to panic. They had a full 2.5-mile oval course that still needed grading and paving. They hadn't even started on the 2.5-mile road course that was designed to twist through the infield and make use of some of the oval's turns. The problem was that for as long as Fisher spent procuring the gleaming white gravel, he'd been neglecting all the other layers of the track surface lasagna that needed assembly before the gravel could be laid. The aforementioned engineer Park Taliaferro Andrew instructed IMS officials that to truly and properly build this track, they'd need several elaborate layers stacked on top of one another, with each layer requiring the procurement of the necessary materials, which we've already learned was a challenge in and of itself, followed by actually putting those materials on the track, laying them in place, and then steamrolling them into a flat layer. Those layers consisted of 2 inches of large gray gravel chunks that were laid down on top of the native red clay soil. On top of that was a 2-inch layer of limestone covered with toroid, a mix of pitch and oil that was designed to seal the layer in place. Then there was a 2-inch layer of toroid-soaked gravel, followed by another 2 inches of the white stones that Fisher was so damn dedicated to topping his track with. There were allegedly benefits to this. The engineer Andrew claimed it would be cheaper than simply laying down asphalt, macadam, or brick. He said the track would be more durable, which would therefore make it faster, and he knew this would work because over in England, the Brooklands Oval Circuit had just been constructed. Its surface was made of concrete, which, while easier to build, started to crumble almost immediately after the weight and speed of the race cars got on top of it. Also, Andrew said that it would be safer, though it's not exactly clear how he came to that conclusion. And also, the big one, this track format would reduce dust. Dust was huge. In an era where most racing was done on dirt horse tracks, and cars that left the driver and riding mechanic sitting upright and exposed, dust could legitimately be deadly. It not only made it hard to see, but it could also tear up a driver's face and crack his goggles, because who knew what else was hiding in all that dust? Unfortunately, the complex paving process took far longer than expected, and the track's first ever race meet was fast approaching. The first event on the schedule was an ill-fated hot air balloon race that I'm not going to dig into here too much. Suffice it to say, most of the people who watched those balloons take off on June 5th, 1909, did so from somewhere else in the Indianapolis region. There was no actual need for them to pay for a ticket in a grandstand, especially since after seeing the balloons lift off, they quickly disappeared over the horizon. No, there were actual racing events scheduled, the first of which was a 2-day motorcycle meet set for August 13th and 14th. At that time, one of the bigger motorcycle sanctioning bodies was the Federation of American Motorcyclists, but it wasn't exactly a professional organization. More than anything, its goal was to host safe racing events that fostered a kind of friendly sort of competition, and from what the FAM had heard about the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, well, it seemed like it would be one hell of a fabulous venue for its annual national convention. When the first motorcycle delegates from the Federation of American Motorcyclists turned up for an early practice session on Friday, August 6th, they did so expecting to see a gleaming, gorgeous, and professionally prepared racetrack. That was what they'd heard so much about in the papers and in the correspondence with the IMS officials who were hosting the race in the first place. That was far from the case. The grandstands and many of the accessory structures were gorgeous, complete, and had even taken on a fresh coat of white paint accented by green trim. If that was all it took to host a race, then IMS would have been a knockout. Unfortunately, the track surface was the critical part, and that was a mess. The artfully constructed lasagna of toroid and gravel and limestone was nothing more than an unmade bed of dirt and rocks and toroid just kind of haphazardly laying on top of the track. Take a moment to imagine you're a motorcycle racer who just traveled all the way out to this brand new circuit in Indiana expecting to see a modern marvel of the motorsport world, and instead you're greeted with a track surface more dangerous than the wooden boards or hard-packed sand you're used to competing on. Now imagine that you are Carl G. Fisher and you've just been told by the Federation of American Motorcyclists that your track is too dangerous to race on, that the meet needs to be canceled when you've been promoting it for months. You've also got a 4-wheeled meet coming up in a few weeks, sanctioned by the American Automobile Association, and if the FAM cancels now, the AAA is probably going to follow suit. But perhaps even more critically, you are expecting 50,000 paying spectators on race day, and if there's no racing, there's no money. And considering how much money you have just spent on this track that you didn't expect to spend, getting butts in seats has become something of a do-or-die situation for your big dream. So Fisher headed over to the hotel where the FAM officials were staying and promised that he, the man in charge of Prestolite acetylene headlamps, would rig the track with over 100 lights to ensure that work continued around the clock, and that come race day morning, the track would be complete. The folks at FAM let Fisher give it a shot, but on Friday, August 13th, the day before the on-track action was actually supposed to kick off in anger, they sent bikes out for practice on a track surface that not only began to crumble the moment a wheel touched it, but that had also become drenched in slime from a snail invasion that only added to the problem. The fastest time of the day was still a full 5 minutes slower than the world record for a motorcycle riding in the same distance, and this was on a track that had continued to claim it would be the fastest in the world. Fisher was probably relieved that rain postponed the first day of action, and he jumped at the opportunity to wine and dine the FAM officials to keep them around for a few extra days so the event could be completed. And over at the Speedway, shifts of laborers were still busy beating the track surface with mallets to compress it further and prepare it for racing. With all these promises and all the hubbub, the race weekend finally got started on Saturday, August 14th. Laborers worked away on this track surface right up until practice for the afternoon's amateur motorcycle race got underway. Almost immediately, a young motorcycle cop named Albert Gibney went down. He was cruising through a corner at about 60 miles per hour when he lost control. Gibney went rolling 200 feet down the track surface while his bike flew off into the distance. He wasn't killed, but his injuries forced him into a 6-week hospital stay, and it meant that the competitors and the remainder of the day's races already started talking about packing it up. And despite jabs from Speedway officials questioning their confidence, a lot of them did. The first race of the day was supposed to feature 13 riders. 9 turned up. Race number 2 had 29 entrants. 10 turned up. The third race saw only 9 of the 15 entrants line up on the grid, and before the fourth race kicked off, a 45-minute delay for track repairs meant that a big portion of the 3,500 fans in attendance also called it quits. That's 3,500 fans, not the 50,000 Fisher was expecting. It was probably for the best, because by the time the 6th race of the day rolled around, not a single rider turned up to start. Fisher was irate that his day's feature race had crumbled just like his track surface. Perhaps motivated by the boos and jeers flowing down from the remaining fans in the grandstand, he made a quick publicity-friendly decision. Instead of the feature, they'd have a 10-mile match race between Ed Lingenfelder and Jake DeRosier. Before they even had a chance to respond, publicity maven Ernest Moras grabbed the microphone and was announcing it as a showdown between the champions of the East and the West. Worth noting here is that neither of these guys were champions in any sense. Lingenfelder lived in Los Angeles, and DeRosier had moved to Massachusetts, and they were both motorcycle racers, but neither actually had any titles to their names. But it's not like the crowd knew any better, and they were intrigued by the idea. For the racers themselves, there was a certain sense of ego gratification to be found, and as far as the Speedway went, this race would prove definitively that the surface was safe for racing. Lingenfelder launched off the starting line in a desperate, aggressive frenzy, determined to win, ignoring DeRosier's pleas of, "For God's sake, take it easy," when they got within shouting distance of one another on the backstretch. The race didn't last much longer after that. As DeRosier neared the main grandstand, his front tire disintegrated, and part of it wedged itself in the front fork of his motorcycle. DeRosier was launched over the front of his bike and onto the gravel-coated track surface, sliding almost 100 feet before he came to a stop. According to Lingenfelder, even the roar of the motorcycles wasn't enough to drown out his competitor's horrified, painful screams. Much like Albert Gibney, the amateur motorcycle cop, Jake DeRosier survived, though he too was confined to the hospital with terrible injuries, only to be killed in a crash a few years later. The remaining spectators flocked to the hospital tent to treat their horror with sherry and some gossip, while Fisher and Moras were forced to call off Monday's schedule. Despite the bloody chaos of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway's inaugural race and a bit of public backlash against the state of the track, no one was calling for its demolition. Rather than being a doomed endeavor, there was mostly just a sense that the folks in charge had tried to do too much too quickly. Again, most of the issues of that race could be pinned on the fact that the track itself wasn't ready. If he could get the surface under control, Carl Fisher reasoned he'd have a winning product on his hands. He also reasoned that he had to have a winning product because he and Ernest Moroz had already been whining and dining the local press in anticipation of their next race at the Speedway, which was happening soon, as in that weekend. As in, the motorcycle race weekend ended in disaster on August 14th, and the 1909 Prestolite Trophy weekend would kick off on the 19th. This is the race that Carl Fisher and Ernest Moroz had initially intended to be the big opening event at IMS, though they soon came to realize it might be a good idea to drum up some publicity with the race before the big car event. To guarantee an event worthy of this formidable track, the Prestolite race was sponsored by Fisher's company. It was scheduled for 250 miles, or 100 laps, and things seemed to get off the ground well. Opening day, August 19th, was a Thursday, but despite the fact that plenty of folks would have been at work, the track brought in a crowd of 16,500 people, mostly women, who paid either $1 or $1.50 for their entry, depending on whether they wanted a reserved seat. Automakers, too, had flocked to the Midway to display their latest machines, and at the start, things seemed to be trucking along quite well. The first sign of discontent came when vendors at the track realized they had a captive audience on a hot day and could double the price of soda from 5 to 10 cents. These vendors were independent retailers who just rented space from IMS, so the track technically had no sway over what they could charge. But Moroz did have to step in to put an end to the practice because fans had grown irate at the idea that they were being bilked of their hard-earned money. Oh, and also, there were still 300 laborers as well as 3 steamrollers that were desperately trying to cure the track surface before the first cars were wheeled out. Cars had practiced earlier that morning and discovered that if they were running in traffic, they would be pelted by stones during the whole event. But without any established code of ethics or any idea of what safety should look like for this new sport, well, no one protested. 5 cars lined up for a 5-mile sprint race, the first event of the day, which was blessedly uneventful. The second race of the day was set for 10 miles, and it too was a little bit of a bore, with Wheeler-Schebler winning the race by a full mile. The crowd was getting antsy, and thankfully they were rewarded by a spicy end of the third race of the day, which saw Billy Bork win from Wild Bob Berman by a mere 3 inches. Allegedly, the crowd was so excited that its roar could be heard from Monument Circle in downtown Indy 5 miles away. But there was another 10-mile race to be run, this one a handicap event that saw various cars with various engine sizes compete against one another. Fisher and Moroz thought that they'd done the calculations in such a way that at the line, there would be an 11-car dead heat for victory. Except that didn't happen. The event was a bit of a damp squib, and the Prestolite event still wasn't about to kick off because there was another race lined up. On the docket now were time trials, where one car would head out to the track in an attempt to break the record for the fastest mile. The whole thing was lost on a crowd that didn't completely understand why outright speed should be compelling, why the honor of breaking a world record should matter to them. But at the very least, the time trials, which saw Barney Oldfield snatch a new record, signaled that we were finally about to see something interesting. The feature. At 2 p.m., the feature event kicked off with just 9 cars on the starting grid. The initial third of the race was fine, perhaps as the drivers got a feel for this new track and what it could handle. But that changed immediately on lap 36 when Louis Strang's Buick burst into flames. Strang was born to a widowed mother in Manhattan tenement building and found some massive success in both the racing world and in the gossip magazines when he kicked off a tempestuous relationship with Broadway dancer Louise Alexander. He was a hard, fearless charger, and when his Buick lit up, he pulled into the pits, helped the crew extinguish the flames, then climbed back into the cockpit, only for AAA officials to tell him he was actually disqualified for receiving outside assistance. Carl Fisher stepped in to advocate for one of the most popular drivers in the field, and the AAA officials eventually relented. Up at the front for the first half of the race was none other than Wheeler-Schebler, a Swiss-born racer who, along with his brother and a few investment partners, founded the Chevrolet car company after they moved to America. He was a damn good racer, but on lap 58, his nameless riding mechanic finally forced Chevrolet off the road and into the infield because a walnut-sized stone had struck Chevrolet's goggles, shattering glass into his already dust-filled eyes. Chevrolet reached up to shake some of the glass loose, only for his goggles to completely disintegrate. And that was just in time for the car in front, driven by Wild Bob Berman, to kick up a spray of dirt and stones in his face. Chevrolet at that point was firmly unable to see, but because he could still hear the car in front of him, he pointed the wheel in the direction of the noise and pressed the accelerator to the floor. It was at this point that his riding mechanic stepped in, perhaps to save both of their lives. Fans were busy watching Chevrolet be escorted from his car when horror struck. Billy Bork and his co-driver Harry Holcomb were rounding turn 4 at high speed when they both peered behind them. We don't know why. Some reporters at the time hypothesized that perhaps they'd heard a strange noise. The problem was that they were approaching the single most dangerous part of the racetrack. Right around the place where Jake DeRosier was thrown from his motorcycle the weekend before, the surface had begun to erode, badly. Over the previous 20 to 30 laps, a bump in the track had crumbled into a ditch 2.5 feet deep. Without any standard safety protocol to suggest that perhaps the race should be called off, the 9 drivers in the Presto Light Trophy race all just made a point of avoiding that ditch and continuing on their way. But Billy Bork and Harry Holcomb looked over their shoulders at exactly the wrong moment, and the right front tire of their number 3 Knox dipped into the ditch. Traveling at around 75 miles per hour, Bork lost control. The front axle snapped, and the Knox skidded, and it flipped twice. Both drivers were thrown from the car. Harry Holcomb flew headfirst into the fence that separated the track from the grandstand, with the Indianapolis Star reporting that, quote, his brains were scattered on the post and the grass. Billy Bork was thrown even further. A man who had earned a reputation for somehow surviving the most acrobatic crashes fans had ever seen, his luck unfortunately ran out at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Bork's body landed against the same fence as Holcomb's, but he didn't strike it head first. In fact, many reporters and spectators said he appeared to be alive and at least a little bit unscathed. Then, he was struck by his Knox, which had not stopped flipping. Reporters claimed that Bork wasn't instantly killed, even though most of the bones in his body had been pulverized. Instead, his death could be linked to the fact that the Knox had smashed his ribs and punctured his lungs. Bork died by drowning in his own blood, but not immediately. He hung on for about 15 minutes, eventually dying in the track's hospital tent. Bork was 30 years old. Holcomb, 26. If this sounds like a good time to stop a race, well, you clearly don't have the marketing mind of one Carl G. Fisher. Not only did the race continue, but Fisher arranged for a press car to ship journalists out to the scene of the accident so that they could get a better look. Ambulances and medical personnel also had to brave a live track to make it to the scene, and plenty of spectators started to flock to the accident wondering what had happened because Fisher elected not to make any announcements about it over the live speaker. The Indianapolis Star wrote, "While the track was alive with terrific racing machines, the physicians carried the dead and dying across the track, dodging the huge steel creations that whizzed by, enveloping all in a cloud of smoke. Workers wiped brain matter and blood away from the fence. Doctors attended to the drivers. One man named Al Dennison, a lifelong friend of Bork, vaulted the fence crying, 'That's Billy! My God, Billy's been killed! We taught each other everything we know about racing.' On lap 88, a 20-year-old driver named Frank Ellis had pit from the lead to make some repairs to his engine. Both he and his riding mechanic passed out from sheer exhaustion. But blessedly, that was the last incident of the day. Wild Bob Berman drove his Buick home to victory, crossing the line at around 7 p.m. Oh, and that was just day 1. There were still 2 more days of racing action to go. Thankfully, Friday was a much quieter affair. The races were shorter with smaller fields, the margins of victory were wide, and there wasn't much urgency in trying to win. The big headlines of the day praised not the racers and their success, but the fact that there had been no accidents to speak of. It was enough to have papers preemptively praising the success of the track, with one further day of racing remaining on Saturday. 37,200 paying spectators flooded through the gates for another day at the track that would lead up to the 300-mile Wheeler-Schebler event. It took all morning for the fans to find their ideal viewing points and for Fisher and Moross to dispense with all of the formalities of the race build-up, including more sprint races, plus an attempt at lowering the world record for the fastest kilometer. Nevertheless, excitement was high when the gunshot at 1:25 p.m. saw 19 drivers rocket into action, hoping to get ahead of the fray and perhaps avoid the worst of the dust. Hometown hero Johnny Aitken struck up a strong lead right from the get-go with his Indiana-built National, running an aggressive pace that saw second-placed Herb Little push so hard his steering gear broke and his Apperson Jackrabbit buried itself in a mound of topsoil. Even Aitken ended up retiring at about the halfway point, telling reporters, "Someone is going to get killed out there today, the way the track is breaking up. There's so much dust I couldn't tell who was in front of me or who was behind me." Those were to prove prophetic words. Somewhere between 175 and 200 miles, Charlie Mertz, driver of a National, asked his riding mechanic Claude Kellum to take the wheel for just a moment while he cleaned some dust out of his eyes. Kellum had started the race, serving as a mechanician for Aitken, but when Aitken retired, he was on hand to help replace a battery for Mertz. Kellum did as Mertz asked, leaning over to take the wheel when their right front tire blew. It was loud and violent, and Kellum completely lost control. The Nationals swerved across the track, through a fence, and directly into a crowd of people. Kellum was thrown from the car, but the National kept moving at race speed. It only came to rest after literally jumping a graded dirt embankment. The car first struck a man named Homer Jolliffe, who had been standing with the group in an area warning spectators about their safety. A furniture factory foreman named Herman Tapking was smacked with a glancing blow, and the National crushed another man. Mayhem struck. People started flocking to the accident scene, though because now it was in a spectator area, there were so many more rubberneckers that a group of militiamen and police had to keep shoving them away. 3 spectators were dying, Kellum was bleeding from innumerable places, and somehow Mertz was able to crawl out from the wreckage of his car with enough presence of mind to turn off the ignition. And yes, the press had been driven out there immediately as well. 6 cars were still running, so the race continued at pace. A driver named Bruce Keene lost control of his Marmon after hitting a pothole and careened into a pedestrian bridge that soon attracted so many spectators it began to sag. Finally, at just 235 miles, the race was called off. Kellum and 2 spectators were killed. Only Herman Tapking managed to survive. In just 3 days, 5 men had been killed at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, not including a 6-year-old boy who was killed by a spectator looking for a good parking place, or another fan who was run over en route to the track. It was time for a reckoning. First and foremost, the AAA were appalled. If you recall the DPTJ episode last year titled SCCA versus AAA, the battle between sanctioning bodies that almost killed racing in America, then you know that the organization's role in sanctioning races was only one small part of its overall goals. The AAA also advocated for safety and wanted to give normal human beings a reason to purchase and drive automobiles. Auto racing was supposed to be an entertaining way to introduce people to cars and to encourage automakers to produce better technology, not to create a death race. Remember, this is an era where there was a lot of concern about the act of racing, because no one had done it yet. Aside from a few 24-hour events that were more just endurance contests, the AAA and a lot of other folks believed that auto races should be capped at 100 miles because beyond that point, drivers were tired. The 200-mile Prestolite Trophy race lasted over 4 hours. Imagine trying to drive an early automobile for 4 hours over a track surface that's continually breaking up. That's not great. Knox, Stoddard, and National, 3 of the early American automakers, announced that they were done with racing, while closer to home in Indianapolis, Coroner John Blackwell decided that an inquest into the deaths of these drivers was desperately needed in order to understand if there was anyone at fault. Blackwell interviewed fans, drivers, and Speedway management before coming to the conclusion that the Speedway founders and management could be blamed for the horrors of the track witnessed that August. While the actual transcript of Blackwell's conversation with Carl Fisher has disappeared, there were apparently enough news reporters invited in to listen that we still have a rough record of what happened. Fisher is reported to have tried several different lines of defense, including claiming that he'd personally investigated the knocks that killed Billy Bork and Harry Holcomb, and he'd found that actually there were several problems wrong with the axle, which means that actually the presence of the rut on the track was not the cause of the crash. It was the faulty car. This was a clear attempt at deflecting blame, though Fisher did in fact go on to admit that he had been expecting crashes at his half-finished racetrack. It is clear that the Indianapolis Motor Speedway company knew that there was going to be a loss of life and limb, Blackwell concluded at the end of his investigation. They were prepared with a hospital, ambulance, and every convenience to take care of the dead and dying. He recommended that the district attorney press criminal charges against Speedway management. The DA ultimately did decline to do so, while good old Mayor Bookwalter said that he had wished there were 100 Fishers bringing cars to his city, since the folks who could afford to buy a car could certainly afford to spend their money in Indianapolis. The only successful suit was a civil one raised by the family of Claude Kellum. After 6 years of investigation, his widow was finally awarded $7,000 from the Speedway, about $250,000 today. Other locals came to Fisher's defense, stating that the drivers were engaging in an act of daredevilry, and that couldn't be blamed on Fisher. They also argued that the spectators who were killed were just standing somewhere they shouldn't have. The newspapers were far less generous than the district attorney. There was a distinct sense of horror that these deaths had been needless, senseless, and occasioned by hubris. In an article titled "More Victims of Speed Madness," the Press and Sun Bulletin wrote, 3 more human lives were sacrificed on the altar of speed at Indianapolis Motor Speedway on Saturday, making 5 victims that in the first week's history of the track have paid the death penalty for speed madness. The paper concluded that there was no benefit to hosting these races, that automobile racing has been and always will be a dangerous and senseless sport. The Huntington Herald wrote, 6 lives in 1 week, and the opening of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway is a pretty heavy sacrifice to the god of speed. And of what good has it all been? Thousands of people have been entertained for a time and horrified in the extreme. The sport seems to be one which may be ranked with bullfighting and even football, and judging from last week's record, it has both together bested. The Detroit News wrote, "What is the significance of these 7 deaths? Spectators of these events have time and again demonstrated that it is a human lust for blood that calls them to the big track meets. This is the final straw. The blood of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway has probably rung the knell on the track racing in the United States." Even the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times weighed in, wondering if auto racing was a way for humans to indulge in the evil that necessarily rested in their soul, and if spectators were thrilled by the barbarism of what they were witnessing. One staunch defender of Carl Fisher was Howard Marmon, an Indy-based automaker who, despite being a little more legitimate in his pursuits than Fisher, still argued that the state of the track had nothing to do with, quote, "the Roman holiday of destruction that had killed so many at the track." He pointed at the weak points of the cars instead, then diverged into claiming if everyone at the track had been driving the clearly superior Marmons, well, no one would have died. Marmon's frosty letter was reprinted in newspapers around America. The outcry was fierce, but if you're listening to this episode now, you know that the chaos of those first race meets did not bring a rapid and decisive end to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, because we're still racing there today. In fact, after promising to shut down the circuit to make repairs, Carl Fisher opened its gates on a cold December morning just 4 months after so many had died. His aspirations were growing bigger and bigger. Perhaps, Fisher reasoned, it might be time to host a 500-mile sweepstakes. But the story of the Indy 500 is one we'll be digging into shortly. And yes, it somehow gets even wilder than this. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next one, we're going to stick with our early American open wheel theme to investigate who really won the first ever Indy 500. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, don't forget to check out the DPTJ Substack. If you have questions, sponsorship opportunities, or you just want to reach out, I have an email for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can find the full list down in the episode description. One of my key references this week was Blood and Smoke, a true tale of mystery, mayhem, and the birth of the Indy 500 by Charles Learson. My good friend Edwin mailed me this a few years back, and I've been obsessed with it ever since. It feels like I learn something new about Indy every time I read it. On top of that, there are plenty of newspaper articles and other online stories linked in the description. Thank y'all for listening to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll see you next time.